A crowded ship drifts in the Mediterranean, packed with survivors who have nowhere left to be sent back to, while the empire that once policed the coastline quietly prepares to leave. In Washington, the safest assumption is that the United States will not touch the match, because the moment it does, oil, alliances, and credibility across a whole region could ignite at once. But in the final hours before Britain's mandate expires, the pressure stops being theoretical. Violence is already spreading, diplomats are already warning of blowback, and the United Nations plan is already breaking apart in real time. Then, Harry S. Truman makes a move that feels almost reckless in the moment. Recognition of a brand new state, issued so quickly it lands before the dust even settles from the declaration itself. The question isn't just why he did it. It's what he believed he was buying with that speed, what he knew he was trading away, and who paid the first bill when the region recalculated. Let's go into the room, and let's trace that trade-off together, here on Rooms Where History. By the time Truman reaches this decision, the Second World War is over, but the moral wreckage is still moving, still hungry, still homeless. Europe is full of displaced people, and among them are Jewish survivors whose return is not a return at all. Many cannot go back safely, and many do not want to. That humanitarian reality collides with a political one. Palestine is still under the British mandate, but Britain is exhausted, attacked on the ground, and losing legitimacy on every side. Arab nationalists, Jewish paramilitaries, and international opinion all pushing at once. Which means the status quo is not stable. It is simply the default setting while everyone waits for someone else to absorb the cost of change. Truman inherits that unstable default at the exact moment the United States is trying to build a post-war order. United Nations legitimacy, a European recovery plan, and an early Cold War posture. The crisis in Palestine is not just one problem. It is a test of what kind of leadership the United States will claim and what kind it will refuse. And that turns a moral question into a strategic one, because leadership always comes with receipts. The key is to see the constraint stack as Truman sees it. First, Britain is stepping away, not because it wants to, but because it believes it cannot hold the mandate without bleeding politically and materially. Second, Arab leaders are warning that partition is unacceptable and that violence will follow. Third, Zionist leaders believe the moment for sovereignty is closing and that delay is not neutral. It is defeat by bureaucracy. Fourth, Truman's own government is split. There are officials who see recognition as a moral necessity and an American statement about the post-Holocaust world. There are also officials who see recognition as a strategic, self-inflicted wound. It could damage ties with Arab states, complicate energy security, and force the United States to manage a conflict it did not create and cannot easily resolve. And then there is timing, the most brutal constraint of all. Because once Britain leaves, no amount of elegant memos can reassemble authority on the ground. Truman is not choosing between clean options. He is choosing between different kinds of mess and different timelines for when the mess arrives. So Britain pushes the problem outward, toward the United Nations, because the UN can give the next decision legitimacy, and legitimacy can sometimes substitute for enforcement. The UN forms a special committee, collects testimony, surveys conditions, and tries to design a settlement that will not immediately collapse under its own contradictions. The committee's work matters, not because it solves the conflict, but because it creates a formal options set for world powers. Once an option is printed, circulated, and voted on, it becomes politically expensive to ignore. And when that option set becomes partition, the crisis enters a new phase. Now there is a proposed border, a proposed division of sovereignty, and a clock for implementation. But none of those things create security by themselves. They create expectations. And expectations, when they are unmet, create violence. Truman's recognition choice will eventually hinge on whether the United States is willing to treat a UN plan as a real foundation or as a document that cannot survive first contact with the ground. In late November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passes the Partition Resolution, an act that is simultaneously historic and fragile. Historic because it signals that the international system is willing to endorse a Jewish state after the Holocaust, and it puts the idea of Arab and Jewish sovereignty on paper. Fragile because a vote does not enforce itself. On the ground, communities are already organizing, arming, and moving, and each side reads the resolution through a different lens. One side as long-delayed legitimacy, the other as imposed loss. For Truman, this moment creates a strategic temptation. If he aligns the United States with the UN vote, he can present recognition as lawful, orderly, and international, not merely emotional. But the same alignment creates a strategic hazard. If the resolution cannot be implemented peacefully, then American endorsement becomes a kind of ownership. It turns a distant conflict into a test of American credibility. And from this point on, every delay or modification will be interpreted as a signal of who has leverage. The violence after the UN vote is not a surprise to anyone paying attention. Civil conflict intensifies, roads become contested, convoys become targets, and Jerusalem becomes a symbol and a choke point at the same time. For policymakers in Washington, this is where the argument shifts. It is no longer only what is right, but what is possible. The State Department's strategic professionals are trained to fear being trapped by irreversible commitments. They see a scenario where the United States recognizes a state quickly, then gets pulled into guaranteeing its survival, militarily, financially, diplomatically, because once you validate a political reality, you are judged when it is threatened. They also see the regional blowback. Arab governments may pivot away from Washington or reduce cooperation, or use oil and access as pressure points. On the other side, Truman's political advisors see the danger of hesitation. If the United States wavers, it risks looking cynical, especially after a war fought under moral banners. So the debate isn't simply morality versus strategy. It's two different strategies, one optimized for regional stability, the other optimized for moral legitimacy and political clarity. Here is the inside-the-room detail that matters. Truman's government does not speak with one voice because the problem touches every sensitive nerve at once: humanitarian responsibility, domestic politics, alliance management, and early Cold War positioning. George C. Marshall, as Secretary of State, represents the institutional fear of a diplomatic trap. His worldview is shaped by coalition warfare and post-war reconstruction. You protect credibility by avoiding moves you cannot sustain. Recognition, in his frame, is not a symbolic gesture. It is a strategic mortgage. Dean Acheson and others around the State Department worry about alienating Arab governments at the exact time the United States wants to counter Soviet influence and stabilize global markets. On the other side is Clark Clifford, and a circle closer to Truman, arguing that delay is itself a decision, and that the United States can shape the new reality only if it acts fast enough to matter. The conflict inside the administration becomes a conflict over time, not whether, but when, and therefore on whose terms. To understand why this lands so hard on Truman, You have to take him seriously as a decision-maker under competing moral and strategic claims. Truman is not a theorist president. He is a man who wants a decision to terminate ambiguity, because ambiguity feels like drift, and drift feels like weakness. At the same time, he has lived through war mobilization, coalition politics, and post-war exhaustion. He knows the public is tired of foreign crises, even as America is being asked to lead a new order. That tension creates a personal style. He favors clarity, but he hates being maneuvered, which is why lobbying pressure can backfire, unless it is routed through a human relationship Truman trusts. And in this story, a human relationship becomes part of the mechanism. Because when institutions deadlock, presidents often decide through people, not paper. Who they believe, who they resent, who they think is minimizing risk, and who they think is hiding it. That is not romantic. That is how power actually works. Now the window tightens. As Britain prepares to end its mandate in mid-May 1948, Washington confronts a brutal reality. Authority will vanish on a known date, and the vacuum will be filled by whoever can impose order with force. That means delay is not neutral time. It is time that changes conditions on the ground. Some officials propose alternatives: international trusteeship, more time, more negotiation, because they fear partition will trigger a wider war. But those alternatives require enforcement, and enforcement requires either British continuation or international willingness to police the transition. Neither is guaranteed. So the administration starts to split into two risk calculations. One side says, do not recognize quickly, because you will own the consequences of a conflict you cannot contain. The other side says, recognize quickly, because if war is coming anyway, you want the diplomatic shape of the post-war settlement to be decided before violence rewrites it. The most dangerous phrase in Washington becomes, we can still manage this. Because by this stage, management may already be an illusion. This is where the decision becomes a trade-off you can actually name. Recognition is a form of diplomatic acceleration. It takes a contested future and declares it a present. That purchase, speed, has benefits. It can establish legitimacy early, shape global perception, and discourage attempts to treat the declaration as temporary. It can also signal to domestic and international audiences that the United States is willing to translate moral language into policy. But the same purchase has costs. Speed reduces bargaining space. It hardens lines before alternative arrangements can mature. It can turn Washington from mediator to stakeholder, and it can lock America into a long-term balancing act in the Middle East, where every subsequent crisis will be interpreted through the initial choice. Truman is essentially deciding whether moral credit and political clarity, acquired quickly, are worth the structural complications that come from being first, being public, and being impossible to reverse. As May approaches, the internal battle sharpens into something personal and institutional at the same time. Accounts from the period describe intense warnings from the State Department, including fears that recognition would inflame the region and damage American interests. Truman's advisors, meanwhile, argue that the United States is already implicated through the UN process, through post-war moral leadership, and through the sheer visibility of the refugee crisis. And there's another pressure spike that rarely gets stated cleanly: domestic politics. 1948 is an election year. Truman is trying to hold a coalition together, and he is also trying to prove he is not merely a caretaker after Roosevelt. That does not mean he buys recognition for votes. It means every foreign policy decision is filtered through the reality that leaders must survive politically to execute any strategy at all. The room is full of people offering Truman a way to be both moral and strong. But strength is never free. Strength is the decision to accept future costs, on purpose, because you believe the alternative costs are worse. The mechanism of how this idea becomes action is not a single dramatic meeting. It is a sequence of memos, consultations, and drafts where language becomes policy. Recognition is not just a feeling, it is a legal and diplomatic instrument. Will it be recognition of a state or recognition of a provisional government? Will it be de facto or de jure? Will it reference the UN resolution explicitly or avoid locking the United States to an unworkable map? These details matter because each one constrains future options. A faster recognition with narrower language can buy immediate legitimacy while preserving some flexibility. A broader recognition can look bolder but reduce maneuvering room. In other words, Truman can try to shape the trade-off by choosing the form of recognition, not only the fact of it. That is how presidents manage risk, by controlling the wording that future diplomats and future crises will be forced to interpret. And this is where the human channel cuts through the institutional gridlock. In multiple accounts, Truman is described as irritated by what he perceives as pressure and emotional manipulation, until the plea comes through someone he trusts personally. Eddie Jacobson, Truman's longtime friend and former business associate, is often cited as a key intermediary who convinces Truman to see Chaim Weizmann. That meeting matters because Weizmann is not merely an advocate, he is a symbol of scientific credibility and political patience, someone who can speak to Truman without sounding like a campaign operation. The point is not that Weizmann wins Truman with sentiment. The point is that he reframes the decision as a moment where hesitation itself becomes a moral and strategic choice. If Truman believes the United States can shape outcomes only through timely legitimacy, then delay looks less like caution and more like surrender of influence. And once Truman internalizes that frame, the remaining question becomes one of timing and language, not of principle. Now the deadline arrives, and the administration has to cash out its arguments. Britain is ending the mandate. Zionist leadership is preparing to declare statehood. Arab leaders are signaling that war will follow. The United Nations is not positioned to enforce a peaceful transition. In this compressed space, Truman's recognition decision becomes what strategists call a commitment signal. By recognizing the new state quickly, he signals to the world that the United States considers this political reality legitimate and durable. That can stiffen the resolve of the new government and its supporters. It can also push other powers to choose sides sooner than they would prefer, because neutrality becomes harder when the United States acts publicly. Truman is not naive about the blowback. The internal warnings make sure of that. But he is making a different bet, that moral legitimacy and diplomatic first-mover advantage will be more valuable in the long run than the temporary comfort of staying out. And like all bets, the cost is paid in uncertainty. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion reads the declaration establishing the State of Israel in Tel Aviv, and within hours, effectively within minutes in diplomatic terms, the United States issues its recognition. This is the hinge. It is not a treaty. It is not a military guarantee. It is a sentence that changes the structure of the crisis. Before recognition, the future is contested legitimacy. After recognition, the future becomes contested sovereignty. That shift is why speed matters. It is also why the State Department feared it. Once sovereignty is recognized, every subsequent act of war becomes not merely civil unrest, but an interstate conflict with global implications. Truman has now bought moral credit and political clarity at the highest possible price point, the price of being unable to pretend he is only observing. And the moment the recognition goes public, the region and the world begins to update its calculations. The first consequence is immediate and violent. Neighboring Arab states intervene, and the first Arab-Israeli war begins. The United States, despite recognition, is not positioned to stop the fighting by declaration alone. In fact, Washington attempts to manage the crisis through the United Nations, seeking ceasefires, mediation, and frameworks that can reduce the risk of a wider regional escalation. This is where Truman's trade-off becomes visible. Recognition delivers legitimacy quickly, but it does not deliver stability quickly. If anything, it accelerates the transition into open conflict because it clarifies what is being fought over, and it forces Washington into a posture that is inherently unstable, supportive enough to validate the new state, cautious enough to avoid being seen as launching a crusade, and pragmatic enough to keep some relationship with Arab governments that still matter for global strategy. Truman has made a moral statement. Now he has to live inside its geopolitical geometry. Here's the quieter part that keeps the story honest. Truman's decision is not the end of the argument. It is the beginning of a new problem set. Washington tries to keep its posture coherent. Recognition on one hand, diplomatic management on the other, and a public narrative that frames the United States as evidence-minded rather than ideological. That balance is hard because both sides, Israel and Arab states, want something from the United States that it cannot grant simultaneously. Israel wants security, arms, and full legitimacy. Arab states want recognition to be slowed, conditioned, or reversed, and they want the United States to prove it is not hostile to Arab sovereignty. Truman cannot solve those demands. What he can do is choose a path that defines American leadership as the willingness to act decisively on legitimacy, then spend years paying for the instability that decisiveness cannot prevent. This is where the long-term complications begin, not as a single backlash, but as permanent maintenance. The second-order effect is diplomatic reclassification. Once the United States recognizes Israel, every Arab leader has to interpret what that means about America's post-war priorities. Even if Truman insists the United States supports regional stability and fairness, the signal received can be very different from the signal intended. In international politics, perception is not decoration. It is a factor that drives alignment. Some governments hedge, some harden, some look for other patrons, and because this is the early Cold War, other patrons exist. Truman's team now has to think in layers, not only Israel and Palestine, but also the Soviet Union, European recovery, and the credibility of the United Nations itself. Recognition may be morally clarifying, but strategically it multiplies the number of relationships that must be balanced. The trade-off is no longer theoretical. Truman has exchanged ambiguity for responsibility, and responsibility is a constraint that compounds over time. Notice how the mechanism keeps repeating. Paper legitimacy collides with ground reality, and the United States is pulled toward the seam. Recognition is paper legitimacy. War is ground reality. Mediation is the seam. Truman's administration tries to use international institutions to contain the crisis precisely because unilateral action would make the United States look like an occupying power of the decision space. That is why the United Nations becomes central, not because it is strong, but because it is the only available framework that can distribute responsibility. This also explains why State Department caution never fully disappears even after recognition. The caution is not anti-recognition. It is anti-entanglement without leverage. Truman has already created entanglement. Now the only rational move is to search for leverage. Ceasefires, talks, armistice lines, anything that creates a structure in which the United States can influence outcomes without owning them completely. That is the real cost of speed. It forces you to become a manager of aftershocks. Another second-order effect is the refugee crisis that hardens into a long-term political reality. As the war unfolds, displacement expands, and the question of return, compensation, and status becomes not just humanitarian, but geopolitical. For Truman, this is where moral credit becomes complicated. Recognition is a moral act in one dimension, acknowledging a Jewish homeland after catastrophe, but the aftermath creates new suffering that cannot be wished away. A neutral analytical reading has to hold both realities at once. A decision can be morally urgent and strategically costly, and it can also contribute to conditions that produce new injustice. This is why Truman's trade-off matters as a case study. It shows how leaders make decisions in a moral fog where every option produces harm somewhere, and the only question is which harms are immediate, which are delayed, and which can be managed later. Truman is betting that later management is possible. History is asking whether that bet was priced correctly. There is also a credibility test inside Washington. Once Truman chooses recognition, his administration must avoid looking incoherent, because incoherence invites pressure from every direction. If Washington appears too supportive of Israel militarily, it risks regional backlash and the perception of taking sides in a war. If Washington appears too distant, it risks undermining the very legitimacy it just granted and looking cynical in the face of post-Holocaust moral claims. This is where Marshall's earlier fears come alive. Recognition can become a one-way door. Even when Truman tries to keep the policy narrow, recognition without a blank check guarantee, the world tends to blur that nuance. Allies ask for more. Adversaries assume more. Neutrals fear more. Truman is now operating under what strategists call audience costs, the political penalty for appearing to reverse course after a public commitment. And audience costs do not only come from Americans. They come from the entire system watching whether American words carry weight. By early 1949, armistice agreements begin to shape the map that violence has already rewritten. And in January 1949, Truman moves from earlier recognition toward full de jure recognition, reinforcing the durability of the state's international standing. That progression is important. It shows that recognition was not merely a momentary political reflex. It becomes a building block in U.S. policy, a foundation that subsequent administrations inherit. This is where long-term trade-off becomes a measurable thing. The moral credit of early recognition is now part of America's self-image and part of Israel's diplomatic legitimacy. The strategic complications are now part of America's permanent workload in the Middle East, balancing relationships, managing perceptions, responding to crises, and absorbing the fact that this one choice narrowed future flexibility. Truman doesn't control the entire arc that follows, but he does control the opening move that makes that arc much harder to avoid. So what exactly did Truman buy with recognition? First, moral clarity at a time when the world was still processing industrial-scale atrocity. Recognition signaled that the United States would not treat Jewish statelessness as a permanent condition after the Holocaust. Second, diplomatic first-mover advantage. Acting quickly positioned the United States as a primary legitimizer of the new state, which mattered for international alignment and for the internal confidence of Israel's early government. Third, domestic political coherence. Truman could present the United States as consistent with its own post-war values, which helped his broader claim to leadership. But the purchase was not free. It came with long-term interest payments, reduced flexibility in dealing with Arab states, repeated crises where America was expected to do something, and a reputation that could be interpreted, fairly or unfairly, as partial rather than neutral. Truman's move turns the United States into a central node in the conflict's diplomatic wiring. Once you are a node, you cannot simply unplug. And what did Truman sell? What did he deliberately put at risk? He sold some measure of strategic ambiguity, which is often the currency of successful mediation. He sold some leverage with Arab governments that wanted the United States to restrain or delay the new state's legitimacy. He also sold time, the kind of time diplomacy sometimes uses to craft enforcement mechanisms, security guarantees, or transitional authorities. When recognition happens quickly, those structures often arrive late, and late structures do not prevent early violence. Truman also accepted a reputational risk. If the region spirals, America's moral statement can be blamed for political outcomes it did not design. That is the trap Marshall feared. But here is the nuance. Truman is not blind to the costs. He is choosing which costs he wants now versus later. He is choosing a cost that is visible, angry reactions, diplomatic backlash, over a cost that is harder to defend morally. Hesitation while a stateless people's opportunity closes. In this frame, the trade-off is not between good and bad. It is between two kinds of responsibility. Could Truman have chosen differently? Yes, but the alternatives were not clean exits. If he refused recognition, the state might still have emerged, and the war might still have happened, but the United States would have started from a position of distance, possibly retaining more flexibility with Arab governments, but sacrificing moral clarity and influence with the new state. If he delayed recognition, he might have bought time for an international trusteeship proposal, but only if there were credible enforcement, something neither Britain nor the UN could easily provide. If he recognized conditionally, tying recognition to specific boundaries or security arrangements, he might have created leverage, but he also might have undermined the legitimacy he was trying to deliver quickly. Each alternative carries a different risk: loss of moral standing, loss of influence, or loss of control over escalation. Truman's decision looks inevitable only in hindsight because we know recognition happened. In the moment, it was a deliberate gamble inside a collapsing structure, taken because every other option looked like a slower collapse with weaker American positioning. The long arc of this decision is not a single line from 1948 to the present. History is not that simple, but we can name the structural effect with precision. Truman's rapid recognition makes the United States an early legitimizing power in the Middle East's new post-mandate order. That position brings influence, but it also brings permanent entanglement. It means American policy must constantly reconcile incompatible expectations, supporting Israel's legitimacy and security while also seeking workable relationships with Arab states and credible frameworks for Palestinian political rights. Those tensions do not arise only from Truman's decision. They arise from the conflict's nature. but recognition accelerates America's entry into the center of that tension, and it narrows future presidents' room to maneuver, because backing away from legitimacy is far harder than delaying it. In other words, Truman's decision does not cause everything that follows, but it does set a direction that becomes expensive to reverse. So, what did Truman achieve in the short term? He delivered rapid legitimacy at a moment when legitimacy was the scarce resource. He anchored the new state's international standing early. He translated post-war moral language into policy, and he positioned the United States as a decisive actor rather than a spectator. But what did he risk? And what did he damage? He narrowed America's flexibility in a region where flexibility is often the only tool that prevents total rupture. He invited backlash that would complicate relationships with Arab governments, and he ensured that the United States would be expected to manage crises it could not fully control. Because once you validate a political reality, you are judged every time that reality is threatened. That is the price of the trade-off. Truman bought moral credit and diplomatic clarity fast, and he paid with long-term strategic maintenance. Years of balancing, perception management, and unavoidable involvement in a conflict with no simple exit ramp. The deeper lesson is analytical, not moral. When a leader makes a fast legitimacy decision inside a collapsing system, the immediate win is clarity. But the hidden cost is that clarity becomes a permanent commitment. In great power politics, speed often substitutes for enforcement in the moment, but it creates enforcement obligations later, whether you want them or not. If you found this episode valuable, please take a moment to like the video. It helps this channel reach more viewers who want calm, evidence-minded history. Subscribe to Rooms Where History for weekly deep dives into the rooms, the choices, and the consequences that reshaped nations. And I'd genuinely like to hear from you. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you think Truman believed he was protecting most: moral leadership, political credibility, or strategic positioning. However you answer, thank you for watching. And thank you for supporting serious historical storytelling.